Hey guys, welcome back. So we are going to use what we left off with in our last video. So if you saw our last video, it was a figurative language review and self-assessment. And what that talked about was learning to identify when language is not to be taken literally. So that was a nice segue into what we're going to talk about today. So we'll go over irony, the types of irony, sarcasm, and paradox. It'll be broken up into three parts. And so this part will be part one, which is an introduction to irony. So make sure that you have your notes. You're going to need them. And as I always say, if you want to take notes, paper and pen or on the computer, whatever works for you, works for me. You know that by now. So go ahead and get whatever you're taking notes on ready and put yourself in as close to a distraction-free environment as possible. So you may have learned about irony in your English classes in the past, but today what you'll get through these three parts is more practice looking at irony in different forms. So whether it be the TV or a poem, we'll just talk about what that looks like and what the purpose is for authors to use these in their writing or in their poetry or in their TV show, so their movie scripts, something like that. So we want to know why people are doing this. What is the purpose? So we'll go ahead and get started. Make sure that your notes you have, I would say, at least about 3 pages to work with, because we can separate it into irony and then the different types of irony, sarcasm, and paradox. So 3 pages should do you just fine. Okay. So as an introduction, I wanted to point out that Robert Frost, a poet that you may have learned about, once said that poetry is one permissible way of saying one thing and meaning another. So in this lesson, you'll learn to, look at this, identify and explain. Okay, so you see this, identify and explain. This is what you're going to learn to do. The purposes of irony and paradox in poetry. So both of these poetic devices are ways of saying one thing and meaning another. So we'll start with irony as it is defined in the dictionary. So there's 2 definitions in the dictionary. The first one says the use of words that mean the opposite of what you really think. And then the second one is a situation that's strange or funny because things happen in a way that seems to be the opposite of what you expected. So pause this if you haven't had time to write it down, and I want you to underline in the first definition, underline words, and in the second definition, underline situation. Those are hints to the different types of irony we'll be looking at. So again, go ahead and pause this video if you haven't had time to write this down. So here's the chart that's going to show us the 3 different types of irony. So go ahead and make a chart real quick. You don't need necessarily the boxes, but you could just do the lines. And our first type is going to be verbal irony. So verbal irony is defined as the use of words in which the intended meaning is contrary or different to the literal meaning. So let's look at these examples. What a beautiful view, he said as he looked out the window at the alley full of dumpsters. So this is ironic, specifically verbal irony, because these are not the words you would expect to hear if someone were looking out a window at a bunch of garbage dumpsters. So the words that are said are not what we as an audience are expecting, so that's verbal irony. Another example is, she described her speeding ticket as an educational experience. It's also sort of a euphemism, which is just a nicer way of saying something. But those then would be they're focused on someone's words. So you have to, we'll talk later about how the audience and their intentions plays a part in how you identify what type of irony is being used. But know, obviously, that verbal irony is based on unexpected meaning of words. Okay, so situational irony is defined as a literary technique for implying through plot or character that the actual situation is quite different than the one that was presented. So, for example, he made himself sick by worrying so much about his health. So, this has probably happened to people before, where you get really worked up about something, right? So much so that it makes you sick. So if someone were worrying about getting sick, but they weren't sick, but they worried so much about getting sick that it made them sick, that would be ironic, because it's not what you would expect. Okay, another example. In trying to forget her, he thought of her even more. How many of you are guilty of doing this? Raise your hand. I see you. I know you're out there. There are so many times, whether it is a day coming up that we're dreading, or a person that we want to get out of our mind, or something we did in the past. There are times when it's so important that we want to forget it, that it takes over our mind, and that all we end up doing is thinking about it. So that's ironic that the one thing you intend to do is get this out of your brain, and that's all you can do is keep this in your brain. So that's situational ironic. Situational irony, sorry. Okay, so the third type, and we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about, we're not really going to spend more than what we're going to say right now about dramatic irony. We won't practice with it, but you should know what it is. So dramatic irony occurs when the audience knows something that the characters don't. So this is prevalent in epic poems or plays written in poetic form. So this is just saying that we won't discuss it much today. Like I said, there just might be some little pieces so you can have a general overview of dramatic irony, but we're not going to really dig deep into any drama. An example would be in Romeo and Juliet. Spoiler alert, by the way, if you haven't completed English 1 and you haven't read Romeo and Juliet yet, maybe don't listen to this part. But the characters think that Juliet is dead. But the audience knows that she has taken a sleeping potion. So that situation is not going to end the way that the characters in the play think it is. Like I said, that's a little bit of a spoiler alert, doesn't give it all away. But the point is that when we're reading it, we know, we're like, no, she's not dead. She's only asleep. But of course they can't hear, even though we yell at those screens and we tell them, but they don't listen. So that would be dramatic irony. So let's move on. Let's talk about some pop culture. So as you're trying to identify and analyze the purpose of irony in poetry, which is what we'll do, so you need to think about what you know and what life irony is surrounding you in pop culture, in your real life. So you have television programs like Saturday Night Live, The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, The Colbert Report, and even The Simpsons, if you've seen that. These shows are notorious or known for making use of verbal, situational, and dramatic irony to create comic effects or to make people laugh. Mysteries, horror movies, thrillers, they often rely on dramatic irony to build tension. So you've probably seen movies in which you're aware of dangers not seen by the characters. This happens a lot in fictional or non-fictional, like crime TV or suspenseful movies, where we as the audience know when someone did something wrong, whether it was murder or robbing someone or betraying a friend. We saw the scene where the person did that thing, but none of the other characters were there. And so we know this, and we're waiting for in the show or the movie or the play, whatever it is. We're waiting for the other characters to figure this out, to see how this plays out. And so that's all part of plot, right? You've talked about plot and building up to the climax. And typically these situations are used to build that rising action to get us to our climax. So when someone else finds out what we already know, that's when we're like, oh my God, what's gonna happen? So that's all part of your plot development. So remember that irony always involves expectations. You should be writing this down. I want you to highlight or underline the word expectations. So you need to know whose expectations are being defied so that you can understand what type of irony we're dealing with. So you're going to write these 3 things down, okay? 3 things. If someone says one thing, but they mean another, that equals, so just put equals, verbal irony. Says one thing, means another, equals verbal irony. If what happens is unexpected by the audience, that equals situational irony. So what happens is unexpected by the audience, that's situational irony. Third, if what happens is unexpected by characters, then you have dramatic irony. So that's when we as the audience know what's happening, but the characters don't. So that's dramatic. And these are pretty easy. You can remember verbal, situational, and dramatic. If you could remember the types, you can pretty much link them to what type of irony that is. So if you haven't gotten that all down, make sure you pause the video here and finish those notes. I'm going to stop this video. So that's the end of part 1, which was just the introduction to irony in a nutshell. So make sure you have your notes ready to go, and we'll pick back up with part 2, which is going to discuss verbal irony and situational irony in a little bit more depth. All right, see you there.